It may be counterintuitive, but it's helpful to include text in code files that the compiler ignores. Programmers generally call them comments because they're often used to comment on code, explaining the rationale behind tricky sections or obscure constructs. They're also useful to make clear the purpose of methods and any assumptions the code makes, as well as to clarify the purpose of method parameters. You can even include to-do notes in the code. But just be sure to go back and clean those up before releasing a product. Another purpose of comments is to comment out sections of code. You can comment out individual statements or blocks of code during development and testing. Maybe a section of code is causing problems and you want to exclude it for the time being. Rather than deleting it, you can comment it out so the compiler ignores it, then restore it later. Using comments this way can help your coding productivity. Like most programming languages that derive from C, C# has two styles of comments: single-line comments and block or delimited comments. Single-line comments consist of two forward slashes, like that right there. These cause the compiler to ignore everything from there to the end of the line. And you can use these in two different ways. To cause the compiler to ignore an entire line by placing the comment characters at the beginning of the line, and that's what these two statements do. Or you can place them to the right of code. So this is explaining about what this piece of code does. So this code, the compiler is going to compile, but it'll ignore everything from those two characters, the forward slashes, to the end of the line. And by the way, don't worry, this is a nonsensical statement. So there's nothing C# about spitzes and blats. Okay, so those are single-line comments. And then you can also use block, or what are sometimes called delimited comments. These let you mark comments on multiple lines using opening /* and a closing */. So this is the opening and this is the closing. As a result, it's going to comment out this entire block of code. So the compiler is going to ignore everything between those opening and closing comment characters. And a technique that I don't particularly favor because I think it generally makes code harder to read is you can even embed block quotes within a statement. So as you can see, Visual Studio has highlighted the comment in green, but it's still going to pass the value of spitzblat to the right line method. So you can't use a single line comment here because if you put two forward slashes, it's going to ignore everything to the right of the slashes. And so this will be an invalid statement because you have to have closing parentheses and a semicolon. And it'll try to make this as part of that statement, and you'll have syntax errors and so forth. So you need to be careful with these kinds of comments. Now, one big problem that's always been a problem with block comments is that you can't nest block comments. So consider this set of code here. So I have a statement there. It's declaring a variable. I have some commented out statements. And then I have some other statements down here that do various things and print something out to the console. It's not important what this code does. So say that I needed to comment out this entire block of code. So what I might try to do is come down here and type in an opening comment character and a closing comment down here. All right, so notice what happened. This code is now commented out, but this code is still live. And I have some sort of a syntax error here because the compiler doesn't know what to do with an */ That's nonsensical. It doesn't do anything. So what's happening is that the compiler is seeing this as the opening character for the block of comments. So this is the start of the block. And then it encounters this second opening and ignores it because it doesn't know what to do with it. It's already in a comment, so that must just be part of the comment. So it's nothing special. And then it encounters the closing comment character here. Now it sees that this is the end of the block comment. And so what follows it is part of code. And so because we can't nest these kinds of comments, this code is live. And again, this is just floating out there in the code file, and the compiler doesn't know what to make of it. In fact, the error there is invalid expression term / invalid expression term this, because it's seeing this as part of the statement. So star / curly bracket doesn't mean anything. And then it also sees that comments isn't properly closed. And so this is going to cause all kinds of problems for the compiler. Okay, so you can't nest block comments. I'm going to get rid of those. So it's generally better to use single line comments to comment out blocks of code. Now, in this particular case, I would need to comment out just 4 lines of code. Not a big deal. I could do that in a few seconds. But if I wanted to comment out, say, 1,000 lines of code, or even hundreds, it's not going to be very productive to do that. Okay, so fortunately, I'm coding in Visual Studio, and Visual Studio makes that easy. All I need to do is select everything that I want to comment out, and I can include block comments in this, and then I can either press Control-EC or come up here and click on this toolbar button, and notice that it does the work of putting those /, those single line comments, in front of all of the lines of code. Another option too is that I can come in here into the Edit menu, and I believe it's in Advanced. I always forget where this is. Obviously I don't use the menu as often. Yeah, comment selection right there. Okay, so if you want to use the menu, you can do that as well. And then when I come back and want to uncomment the code, I can just click on this right there, and now it's restored to its proper state. I still have the block comment there, and all of these lines of code are now reactivated. Discussions about commenting in any language can reach a fevered pitch among developers, normally reserved for religious and political discussions. I strongly suggest that you find a personal style and philosophy that works for your programming style, and make sure it works to help you understand the code 6 months from now when you have to come back and make a change, and the memory of why you did something has faded. Generally, I think it's best to comment your code liberally, but there's no need to state the obvious about what your code is doing. Comment on things that are not readily apparent from a quick read of the code. And keep in mind that there's a good chance that someone else will need to understand your code at some point in the future. What will they need to know? Let that guide your commenting. For the most part, the C# compiler ignores whitespace, at least the characters used for non-essential formatting. Whitespace includes carriage returns and line feeds. Those are usually in a pair that you'll find at the end of lines. It also includes spaces and tabs that aren't necessary for proper syntax in your code. This means that some whitespace characters are significant, such as the spaces that separate language tokens that can't be adjacent because they consist entirely of alphanumeric characters. The compiler needs a way to distinguish adjacent alphanumeric tokens, and C# uses one or more spaces to provide that distinction. Other necessary whitespace includes the spaces embedded within string literals that separate words and sentences, and preprocessor directives, which aren't really part of your code, but are essentially instructions to the compiler, need to be on their own lines. On the other hand, the C# compiler will completely ignore most superfluous whitespace. This means that you're free to break statements up over multiple lines using carriage return line feed pairs, and add extra spaces and tabs between tokens in your code, but not within the token names themselves. This is also the reason why you can format lines of code with tabs or spaces to neatly organize it to make it more readable to humans, indenting blocks of code, for example. The compiler just ignores that whitespace at the beginning of lines, as well as any blank lines that you include. Going even further, you can put multiple semicolon delimited statements on a single line in your code file, making it as long as you like. This is because C# is a statement-oriented, rather than line-oriented programming language. So even the carriage return line feeds between statements are superfluous, although it makes your code far more readable and maintainable. So I certainly don't recommend removing all extraneous whitespace from your code. That would be a nightmare to read. The classic line-oriented programming language is Visual Basic. In earlier versions of the language, you had one statement per line, so there's no need for a statement termination character like C#'s use of the semicolon. But more recent versions of the language of Visual Basic have allowed the use of the underscore to break a statement across multiple lines. And even more recently, in some cases, the underscore was optional as long as the VB compiler could tell that it was all one statement. But C# is much stricter about being statement-oriented than VB is line-oriented. Okay, now, strictly speaking, superfluous whitespace in code files slows the compilation process down slightly. I really doubt that you would ever notice the performance degradation, since the compiler is highly optimized for speed, even for your largest code files, and that got even better with Roslyn. So that also is no good argument for making your code less readable and maintainable. And the assembly files that the compiler produces are binary files, despite the fact thatildasm.exe makes the IL look like well-formatted text. So the whitespace in your code files doesn't make it into your assemblies. Consider this line of code. I've written the statement here as a typical programmer would write it. So I have the int, space, counter, space, equals, space, 45, space, times, space, I, and semicolon. Okay? It's nicely formatted, it's attractive, it's easy to read. Separating the tokens with a space just makes it easier to read and easier to understand. Okay, if I comment out that code, just so the compiler doesn't complain, I can look at this item here. Now, I could not write that statement this way. The space between int and counter is required. The reason for that is that I have two alphanumeric tokens, int and counter, that are next to each other, and the compiler has no way to know that I mean int and counter. All it can do is consider this to be a single, complete C# token. So it complains about this because I've not declared the int counter variable anyplace. Okay, so that form of the statement is not going to work. The white space between int and counter is crucial. But I could write the statement this way. This is perfectly valid. There's no red squiggly line. The compiler is happy with it. I have a space between int and counter where I have to have a space. But because the other tokens in the rest of the statement are not alphanumeric keywords or identifiers, the compiler can tell that the equal sign is not part of counter, so that's a different token. It can tell that the equal sign is not part of 45. It can tell that 45 is not part of asterisk. It can tell that asterisk is not part of I. So I don't need the spaces between those other tokens within that statement. Now I happen to think this is a little bit harder to read. It's not so bad with this short statement, but if you have a longer statement, a complex expression, then this can make it very much more difficult to go back and read. And again, you want to keep in mind that at some point it's inevitable that you or somebody is going to have to come back in and maintain this code. Or of course, in this code would be me. And so you want to make it as readable as possible. Okay, so I'm going to restore this and come back to my original statement. And then another example is the declaration of the method here. So I have private space, static space, void space, white space. And I could have tabs in between there if I wanted. Spaces is the convention. I couldn't write that as this right here. So if I remove the comments there, this is an error. It's seeing that I have some sort of an object here, some sort of method, and it has a code block, those squiggly brackets. But I have a squiggly line right here that indicates that I have a problem, because it doesn't really know what to make of this code here. Because the spaces between these alphanumeric tokens are required. You have to have them in order for this code to compile. Because again, the compiler is going to consider that to be a single long name for something. But it also sees that something as odd is going on here. Of course, I have the empty block there. That's easy to solve. But this just is not going to syntactically work. But it's certainly not going to declare this as a white space method that returns a void that's static and is private to this class. Okay, so I'll hit Control-Z to put those comments back in. Okay, as I mentioned, superfluous white space is generally fine. So here's how I would typically write a statement. So I have spaces within the string. I have to have those spaces. I have spaces between the tokens. I don't necessarily need to have spaces between a variable or something here and parentheses, although a lot of programmers do put spaces in there and space there, and so forth. So that's the typical way of writing it. But this way of writing it is perfectly okay. So in this case, I have console, and I forget if that's a spaces or, yeah, those are spaces. And then dot, more spaces, and then more spaces. And basically I have spaces, extra spaces between every token within this statement. And that's perfectly fine, because the C# compiler is going to strip out all that extraneous space. First of all, because it sees the semicolon here, it knows that the previous statement is ended. It sees the semicolon there, so it knows that everything here is a single statement, or at least I'm intending it to be a single statement. And then it sees this token here, sees that it's followed by something it understands, a dot expression. And so it sees all of the extraneous white space there, just strips it out, and puts the dot right next to the console. So the compiler actually sees this statement as exactly the same as that statement, and they'll get compiled identically. And then you can even take it to an extreme. In this case, I've put every token on its own line, and for good measure, I've added some additional leading spaces on every other line. This is not a practice I'm recommending. I'm just showing you kind of the extreme of where you can take this. So this would be a nightmare to read. Simple statement, I already kind of know what it's doing, but to kind of read this and fit it all together, at least my brain doesn't quite work that way. But the compiler is perfectly happy with how I've written this code right here. Now, splitting single statements on multiple lines is common when the statements are long and consist of multiple expressions. Putting logical units on each line makes it easier to read, and it's all in the interest of making the code easier to understand. So generally what I do is, well, it really depends on the resolution of my monitor. So if I am working at my regular desktop machine with a pretty big monitor with pretty high resolution, then I can have some pretty long lines of code, much longer than here in this relatively low resolution I'm using at the moment. So a lot of people put in line breaks when the code disappears on the right side of the monitor. If I had code that was disappearing to the right here, I put in a break someplace before the right edge so that I could see all of the code without scrolling left and right here. That gets to be a big pain. But generally, if I'm using high resolution, I find that super long statements like that, unless it's a literal string or string literal, then I'm going to put in more line breaks, because I find it easier to read statements that are, say, maybe this long and go on for 2 or 3 lines. If it's a really long, complex statement, it's just easier to read in that format. But then, if there are different components, say a link expression, which is a way of querying collections of data, databases and collections in memory and so forth, sometimes those get pretty long and gnarly, and you can chain together different method calls together. So I may put each method call that's involved in a link statement on its own line, just putting in a carriage return line feed. And then it's very easy to see the breakdown of what the statement is doing, because each chunk of that statement is a logical expression. So again, it's something that you need to kind of feel through what works best for you, what makes the code readable, and keep in mind though that the person coming back and maintaining the code may not have as high resolution monitor as you do. Okay, so keep it in mind. All right, and then another reason to use superfluous whitespace in order to make the code more readable in a different way. So a common use of whitespace is to declare a number of variables like this, lining up the data types, the name of the variables, and then the values. Now, this isn't the greatest example that I came up with here, but a lot of times you're declaring a number of variables that are related. And it's helpful to be able to just scan down and see the variances between each of the definitions. And so lining them up is useful. And so all I did here is I have the declaration and I have a couple tabs and then more tabs over so that they're lined up. Okay, and then one last example is putting multiple statements on a single line. This is the extreme example of getting rid of all extraneous whitespace other than the leading characters. So I have the leading characters here, those are tabs, in order to just line this up and make the overall method code be easier to read. But then within the statement, the only whitespace that I have is the single required space between int and factor. Because those are both alphanumeric tokens, I have to have that space. But then every other space is gone, including the carriage return line feeds between statements. And this is perfectly legitimate. Compiler knows exactly what to do with this because C# is statement oriented, not line oriented. So it sees the first statement is this, comes to the semicolon, okay, does what it needs to do with that statement, looks at that code, sees a statement, knows what to do with that statement. It's something it understands, and then knows what to do. Whoops, I'm going to move that. Don't want to do that. I'll undo that. And then my final statement is right here. By the way, what I just did that I didn't intend to do, when you have code highlighted, you can grab it, hold down the mouse button, and move it someplace else. So that's what I inadvertently did because I dragged the middle section there. So yet another nice feature. A lot of code and text editors have that kind of feature. Microsoft Word does it and so forth. So nothing special about Visual Studio. It's just another one of those nice things that you can do with writing code within Visual Studio.